Alright, full bias disclosure, Condi Weaver is my favorite build in the entire game. I really do think it manages to be a great example of the strengths, the weaknesses, and the fantasy of playing an elementalist as a class without falling into some of the traps that other variants have to deal with. Seriously, when this build was being established after the release of Path of Fire, I was so happy to finally have a rotation that actually made use of all of the elements, rather than just two or sometimes even one, as was the case with a lot of builds at the time. Weaver being the only spec that makes Staff Elementalist fun is a hill I'm willing to die on. Anyway, enough weird trivia about me, let's talk about Condi Weaver. This build really has it all, unless you include all to mean accessible CC, that is. Thanks to Weave Self, as I said, you can run a rotation that goes through all of the elements and still feels really smooth. But if that's too much for you, there's also a simplified version of the build that uses Fire Elemental and just goes through Fire Earth. In the footage, I'm still using the sword version of this build, because I'm so used to it that I just didn't think about it, but recently the scepter changes actually made that the strongest version of this build DPS-wise. And you are melee locked on the sword version specifically, but you run Earth traits that give you incidental damage reduction, Earth skills that have evades, barrier generation, and a Condi cleanse on it, and the panic button that is Obsidian Flesh. Oh, and one of your glyphs that you just run inherently is also a stun break. You can also use the sword trait on this build for a negligible damage loss. It's less than 1000 at the top end, and a gain of 2 to 3000 health, just baseline, depending on which weapon you're running, and that's before you factor in damage reduction. So I'd argue that if you kind of know what you're doing, this build has the best survivability of any LADPS build. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to run sword. In fact, Condi Weaver takes after the ranger tradition of kind of just making every main hand weapon viable. You can run sword, you can run dagger, you can run scepter, and you can even run staff. And if you're not running staff specifically, that means you're running focus, because offhand dagger would be really terrible on this build. And focus alone takes your utility factor from non-existent to at least passable, which doesn't sound great, but for Ellie, that's pretty damn good. I already extended the length of this video, and yet I'm running out of time again, but I can't stress enough how much I love this build, and if I've sold at least one person on it, then I'm already happy.